I'd love to fire his. He should be fired. Guy's grossly incompetent, and he should be sued for spending $4 billion to build a little building. I'm building a ballroom that's going to cost a tiny fraction of that, and it's bigger than the whole thing put together.
It looks like the president wasn't bluffing. The Federal Reserve itself is now under criminal scrutiny, and Wall Street is paying close attention. Welcome to the Big Money Show, everyone. I'm Jackie DeAngelis, along with my co-hosts Taylor Riggs, David Asman, Brian Brenberg, and with us for the hour, Lansky Partners President Lee Carter.
Hey,
great to see you.
Thank you.
Federal prosecutors have opened an investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell over a $2.5 billion renovation of the Fed's Washington headquarters and whether Powell misled Congress about how big that project really was. The fallout was immediate. Stocks sank, gold surged, and treasuries rallied as investors rushed for safety. Powell pushing back hard, framing this as intimidation.
This unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
The investigation lands just as President Trump signals that he's already chosen Powell's replacement, with Kevin Hassett emerging as one of the top contenders. Markets are reacting to uncertainty at the very top of monetary policy, right as inflation data and major bank earnings are going to hit this week. So let's dig right into it. Lee, I want to get your take on this. Jerome Powell claiming essentially that this is weaponization of the government. There have been cases of or the Justice Department. There have been times that we have seen that certainly in the past. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes it's not. There are many who want some accountability regarding Jerome Powell's hand in this. How, as the Fed chair, could you possibly, sign off on a budget of a project like this and then admit that prices are high because of inflation, of all things? My God.
I mean, the contradictions here abound, and I think that people are trying to make sense of what to do with all this. So you see a lot of people who are saying this is absolutely insane. There's people who are outraged and saying that Trump is weaponizing his office. But I think when you talk to the average voter, they're looking at this and they're saying, you know what, I actually already believe that the Fed was politicized. Mm-hmm. And they might be thankful that the president is coming down hard on this and saying that there shouldn't be, corruption. There shouldn't be misuse of funds, and there shouldn't be any politicization here. And so I actually am worried not just about the Trump versus Powell effect as much as I am about the erosion of trust that's going to happen on the Fed, which is a really important institution to all of us. And it's such an interesting play because there's not that much time left in his tenure. I mean, this could just play out over the next few months. So why now? Okay. That's my big question.
And David, that's been your question. We were talking about this in the break just moments ago. You also are questioning the timing and saying, what's the point?
Well, the worst thing is it turns a bad Fed chair who's been following bad advice from a mediocre board of 300 lousy economists, from my perspective, and we just see it by their record. You can only judge somebody not by what they say, but by the record that they have. And his record is terrible. The 300 economists' record is terrible. They've been wagging the dog in terms of telling him what to do. It turns him into a martyr. Mm-hmm. I mean, he would have left as kind of a footnote in the history of the Fed in terms of his bad record. Instead, the first thing they're going to say in the history books is the man who was persecuted by the president, the one man who's it's turning him into a martyr. We don't need that. All we need is his example of what a mediocre Fed chair looks like. That's why I'm against it. Of course, look at the market. The market started terribly down. The Dow is now down only about 50 points.
It'll be green by the time you're done talking.
It may well be, but the point is, I think that they believe that eventually either the grand jury won't indict Powell, or perhaps if they do, it might be in a very minor charge it'll get off on. But again, this is going to be the number one reference in history to Jerome Powell, not the fact that he was a bad Fed chair, which he is.
Whereas you could have let his own failures become his legacy. But Taylor, market reaction was pretty significant. I wouldn't expect it to be, but it was pretty significant. This wasn't a market that took this on the chin.
Yeah, no, and what I don't like, and David, I'm tending to agree with you here, is when you see gold, silver hitting records and the dollar going weaker, that creates that narrative of sell America, dollar debasement. Everyone's flocking to gold and silver because we can no longer trust the dollar and the Federal Reserve, and this is a banana republic. I mean, I heard all of those things on X yesterday. Not that we believe that we're a banana republic, but it creates that idea that we are interfering a little bit, and that's what I don't like. So when you take a look at platinum, silver, gold, Jackie, don't like that. Now, the good news is Treasury yields are not moving. If this were a serious thing, and I'm going to talk like I'm Dagan for a minute, we would see 10, 20, 30-year bond yields rise. We're not seeing that. They're mostly stable on the day. Here's the sort of implication for Americans. Did Trump just shoot himself in the foot? Rates were coming down. Yeah. Now, the odds of a January rate cut just went down because people think that there's no way now they're going to cut rates because that looks more political. Does this mean that Jay Powell stands his ground and he doesn't cut? And instead of stepping down in May, he goes on until the end of his term in January 2028. Now, it doesn't mean he'll be chair, but he'll be on the board and more defiant. Mm-hmm. Now, what if they appoint someone in the chair and the rest of the board doesn't vote the way the chair votes? That's new. That's different. What does that look like? Usually the board votes in line with the chair. So some people are saying, look, we have checks and balances in place. I just get nervous about appearance. You guys know I came in pretty institutional, generally on board with what the Fed was doing. I liked what, at least sort of the independence pre-2024 that they were appearing to do. And this meddles the picture for me. I don't love it.
Does this meddle the picture, or did he already politicize the Fed when he cut rates before the election, basically in favor of Kamala Harris? And right now, I wonder about this question of, does it make it more difficult for him? If he wants to be obstinate, he won't cut, or he won't vote to cut in January. But the conditions would suggest, with inflation taming somewhat, and the weakness that we've seen in the labor market, that he should. So if he doesn't, that doesn't make Trump look bad, although it would be bad for the market. It makes him look 100 times worse. Then you're fighting political punches with political punches.
This is all very confusing, Jackie. That's a very confusing stew of things. So one thing I noticed right away, like you, Taylor, I looked at the 10-year, okay? Do we have like a 5-day chart of the 10-year Treasury, by the way? That'd be awesome if we had one of those. Because if you look at a 5-day chart of the 10-year, what you'll find is we're at a level of interest rates today that we were at 5 days ago. Was the Fed going to be not independent 5 days ago? I mean, so the market didn't it immediately cared, and it obviously doesn't care now. There's a lot of hyperventilating.
But don't you think gold and silver mean the market cares a little bit?
It cares a little bit, but like this is I'm reading Janet Yellen and I'm reading Ben Bernanke tell me this is the end of Fed independence. And I'm watching the 10-year, like, look at it. There's your 10-year, okay? Nobody cares. Here's why I think.
Okay.
Here's why I think, my last point on this. I was thinking about home renovations, okay? If you started a home renovation, okay, and at the end of the renovation, your renovation bill came in more than 30% over budget, would you investigate?
I would.
I would investigate. I would want to know why I'm more than 30% over budget, okay? And there may be great reasons for that, in which case I will say, thank you for the work. I'm sorry it was so expensive, but nothing could be done, okay? But there is a chance.
But do you need a criminal investigation?
This is how the government investigates things. This is how the DOJ investigates things.
David, I think you made this point. It may not move past the grand jury phase.
It may not.
So,
it may not. I mean, there is an old phrase that you could, indict a ham sandwich with a grand jury, but this may be one of those exceptions to the rule. Again, it's intent. You have to prove intent here. Was his intent to lie, or was he just doing what, for example, on rate cuts or rate increases, he's always just basically been doing what those 300 economists tell him to do, which is basically wrong, which is why I want him as an example of what a Fed should not do, not what a Fed should do. And now instead we'll have him be a martyr to the Trump hysteria.
I'm glad you brought up intent, because I actually don't think his intent was to lie in any way. But I do question what on earth he was thinking when he was going over the plans, even in their initial form, some of them very lavish for some of these spaces. And I laugh when he says he came in 30% over budget because of inflation. It's funny, but it's not funny. I mean, these are real world problems. I expect him to understand that more than anybody else. I'm not saying that the space wasn't in need of some sort of repair or renovation, but the extent to which he did it was kind of thumbing his nose up at the American people.
Can I just say one final thing? I got to Brian's point. We haven't seen all the evidence. I mean, that's going to be displayed in front of a grand jury. They're going to be the ones who have to decide. I haven't seen all the evidence. Obviously, somebody made terrible mistakes, and probably those mistakes benefited some party. So in that sense, I'm glad to get it out. So
think how many times
you make a good point on that.
Think how many times taxpayers have had whatever they were told that was going to be spent be 30%, 50%, 100%, 200% over. And at some point, you're like, you know what? Knock it off. Let's investigate and find out. Sorry, no, you're not entitled to the job. This comes with the territory.
And Jackie, did you think it was interesting? Anthony Pompliano pointed this out, and I just throw this out there, that instead of using that video opportunity to talk about the charges, he used it as, oh, no, this is a political tool. And again, the timing also out within minutes of the article. We could talk about that. So if that's sort of like dangling the distraction over here, that's some of the commentary.
I actually think that is one of the more interesting things about what voters are going to take away from this, and the American people are going to take away from this. Are they going to be paying attention to the charges, which are about misuse of funds, or are they going to say this whole thing has been politicized and I'm now going to be taking on that we can't trust anybody? And that's what I'm really worried about, because this lack of trust in the institution is a big, big issue. Look, I think especially when you think about investor confidence.
You're touching on something, and it's that both sides do it, but at some point one side has to stop to kind of try to end it. And hopefully then it would stop down the line as well. But if everybody keeps perpetuating it, then the charade just goes on and on. But we're going to take a break from Powell. We'll talk about this a little bit more later and take a look at Google.
Shopping. Who loves to e-commerce shop?
Me.
We all do. Pop quiz, 5 for 5. Oh, well, Brian is, no, of course. Debbie Downer over there. So this is fun. Google's adding the ability for users to shop directly within the Gemini chatbot. Jackie, and also using the AI mode search tool. So basically, here's an example. They have this, let's say retailers can come on their website and allow shoppers to describe what they're looking for. Let's say I want a velvet sofa in emerald green that can withstand pet hair, but it needs to be under 90 inches.
Let's just say, for example.
This is a real test case. I took it directly from the page, and the agent will now filter all of those within the budget and present you with ideas.
Cool. That's like having a designer in your pocket in some ways to be able to match those specifications. But I will say this, one of the ways that I was getting taken was on Instagram. Some of the retailers that I shop on, they put them in my feed. It's an ad. I'm not following these retailers. And then I see it, I'm scrolling and I'm buying things. So I shut all of that off, because January is not only dry January, but it's stop shopping January.
Bless you.
Would Gemini tell you, that's an ugly couch, you should pick a different one?
The value is in the eye of the beholder.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Just make it easier to
We will
spend.
not get you an emerald green velvet couch less than 90
I already have
inches.
3 of them.
That is pet hair resistant. Note to self.